All right, let's dive into zero trust architecture today. Specifically, we're going to look at it from an API developer's perspective.
That's good.
So, to guide us, we have Dipin Behl's presentation from APIDays Hong Kong 2023.
Okay.
He is a principal engineer at Stryker, and I really like that he kind of gets rid of all the jargon and focuses on like practical steps.
Yeah. Having a practical approach is good. A lot of times security can get pretty abstract, especially when it comes to actually implementing it.
Totally. Okay, so zero trust, the basic concept is never trust, always verify. But I'm curious how that plays out in the real world for someone building APIs.
It's a totally different way to think about security. Like before, we focused on protecting the perimeter of the network, but now we're building in security checks into every single interaction, even between internal components.
So even if a request is coming from inside my system, I can't just assume it's safe.
Yeah, that's right. You have to verify every single request. Like imagine you have a guard at the front gate of your house. That's the old way. But with zero trust, you have a guard at the door of every room in your house.
Whoa, okay. A lot more guards. I guess that makes sense with APIs, especially if you're using microservices where you have all these independent services talking to each other.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not just about writing secure code, it's about making sure everything around your API is secure too.
Yeah, Behl actually breaks down zero trust architecture into 4 main areas: devices, identities, applications, and infrastructure. API developers have to deal with all 4 of them.
Makes sense.
You need to secure the devices accessing the API, manage user identities, build security into your code, and also make sure the infrastructure itself is secure.
Okay, so it's a very holistic approach then.
Right, yeah. And within that, Behl talks about 3 main principles of zero trust: verify explicitly, least privilege, and assume breach.
Gotcha.
These are kind of like the guiding principles for implementing zero trust.
I get verify explicitly. That's like checking every single thing about a request before you let it through.
Yeah, exactly.
No assumptions.
No assumptions. It's like, you know those super strict bouncers at clubs? It's like that, but for API calls.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
And least privilege, that's about giving the absolute minimum access needed for a specific action, right?
Right. So like you might be allowed to enter a building, but that doesn't mean you can access the executive suite unless you're authorized.
Right.
It's all about minimizing damage if a breach happens.
Okay, that makes sense. But assume breach, that one's a little trippy. It's like always assuming the worst.
Not necessarily the worst, but you're prepared. Like you know you have a security system, but you also set traps just in case.
Okay, so you're designing your API to be resilient even if someone manages to get in.
Yeah, things like intrusion detection, logging, incident response. You need to know if something's wrong and how to react.
That makes sense. So we've got the what of zero trust, but why is it such a big deal now? What's changed that makes this so important?
Well, the old perimeter-based security, like firewalls, it doesn't really work anymore. You know, we've got cloud computing, people working remotely, more complex systems. It's just not enough.
Yeah, the attack surface is way bigger.
Plus, it's not just about external attackers anymore. It's also about insider threats, compromised devices, even problems with third-party services that we use.
So it's both keeping the bad guys out and limiting the damage if they do get in. Like Behl said, think about ransomware spreading through a system. With the old security, it's like game over. But with zero trust, you might be able to contain it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like creating separate compartments, so even if one area gets breached, the whole thing doesn't collapse.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a little reassuring. So we've got the principles, the why. Now I want to know the how. How do we actually implement zero trust for APIs? Where do we even start?
Behl suggests starting with defining a trust authority.
Okay.
It's basically a system for deciding what's trustworthy, what's not, kind of like a digital passport office.
So before we build anything, we need to figure out who's in charge of verifying identities and granting access.
Yeah.
And that's probably going to look different for a small startup versus a huge company, right?
Right. It's about finding the right balance between security and practicality.
Okay, makes sense. So once we have our trust authority figured out, what are some of the common ways to actually implement zero trust for APIs? Behl talked about oath, managed identities, and MTLS. Are these like completely separate things or can they work together?
That's a great question. I think that's where things get really interesting for API developers. They aren't necessarily exclusive. Like you could use OAuth for external users, managed identities for internal services talking to each other, and MTLS for securing communication with IoT devices, just as an example.
So it's about picking the right tool for the job and then figuring how to make them all work together.
Yeah, exactly. Creating a layered defense.
Okay. Cool. So that's what we'll look at next. The specifics of each approach, the pros and cons, how it all fits into this zero trust picture for APIs. Welcome back. So I think Oath is probably the most familiar one for our listeners.
Right.
We use it all the time with web apps. But how does it fit into a zero trust system?
Well, it's taking that familiar oath and using it in a slightly different way. So you're already using it for authentication, checking who's making the request.
Right.
But in a zero trust world, you're using it more to control access to different parts of your API. It's about fine-grained authorization.
So it's not just about, can you log in? It's more like, can you, with these specific permissions, access this data or do this specific thing?
Exactly. And Oath, because it uses JSON web tokens, it actually gives you a way to build that kind of control right into your API.
Okay.
You're basically putting authorization info directly into the token, so every request carries its own security context.
Gotcha. But like you said before, we often have different kinds of users accessing APIs, both internal and external. Oath seems to work well for those outside users. But what about internal services talking to each other? Like in a microservices architecture? That's where managed identities come in, right?
Yeah, exactly. Managed identities are a game changer, I think, for securing those internal API communications, especially when you're in the cloud. It's like, imagine each service has its own ID card issued by the cloud provider itself.
Yep.
And you don't need to mess around with shared secrets or passwords anymore, which are easy to compromise.
So if service A needs to talk to service B, it just shows its ID card, and the cloud provider handles all the authentication and authorization in the background.
Exactly. But Behl used that example with Azure Functions accessing a database securely without needing to hard code any credentials. It just makes things so much cleaner and more secure.
Okay, so OAuth for external, managed identities for internal. But what about those situations where you need even stronger security, like super sensitive data or when you're talking to IoT devices?
Right.
I'm thinking about scenarios where you want to make absolutely sure that only very specific devices can even connect to your API at all.
That's when you bring out the big guns MTLS.
Okay.
It's like, you know how people have secret handshakes? It's
Yeah.
like that. Only the right people know the handshake. You use digital certificates and private keys to establish trust at a very, very deep level.
Okay, so it's not just about verifying who's making the request. It's also about making sure the communication channel itself is secure.
Absolutely, yeah. End-to-end encryption. And Behl mentioned something about zero-knowledge proof algorithms. That's another layer on top of MTLS for even stronger security.
Wow. Okay, so it's like sending a message that only the recipient can open, and even the system itself can't read it.
Exactly.
That's pretty wild. But is that something that, regular API developers can actually use? Or is it too complex?
It's definitely more advanced, but it's becoming more and more relevant, especially with all the data privacy rules and the need to protect sensitive info.
Right. Makes sense. So for our listener, they might be thinking, okay, all these options, how do I choose what's right for my APIs?
That's the million-dollar question. It depends on what your specific security needs are, what kind of data you're dealing with, who's using your API, what kind of devices are connecting. It all factors in.
It's finding that balance again, security versus practicality.
Right. And you don't have to choose just one. In fact, you often shouldn't. You can combine these different approaches to create that layered defense that we talked about.
Yeah, like Behl said, it's not about building an impenetrable fortress. It's more about building something that's resilient, adaptable, and that can handle whatever gets thrown at it.
Yeah, and that's the core of Zero Trust. It's a process, not a destination. You have to keep monitoring, evaluating, adjusting as new threats pop up.
And that's where tools like CM and SOAR come in.
Exactly. They automate a lot of that heavy lifting, monitoring, and responding to incidents. They're like your eyes and ears, basically.
Okay, so that gives a pretty clear picture of how Zero Trust actually works in the real world of API development. But there's one more thing from Behl's talk that I wanted to touch on, the trust authority. We talked about it a bit earlier, but maybe we could dive a little deeper.
Yeah.
It seems like a pretty central part of the whole thing.
Absolutely. The trust authority is like the brain of your Zero Trust system. It makes those critical decisions about who gets access to what. You have to design it carefully.
So as an API developer, I have to think about how I'm going to implement that trust authority, whether it's centralized or distributed, how it fits into my existing systems.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just about choosing the right protocols or tools. It's about building a system that manages trust and access control across your entire API world.
Okay. That's really helpful. This has been a great discussion. We've really covered a lot, from those high-level zero trust ideas down to the nitty-gritty details for API developers. But before we get to our final takeaways, I wanted to get your take on one more thing. Behl talked a lot about security as code. What does that actually look like for people who are building APIs?
It's a powerful idea, really changes how we think about security. Instead of treating security as something you tack on at the end, you're building it in from the very start.
Okay.
Your security policies, your configs, even your tests, they all become part of your code. And they go through the same rigorous process as any other code you write.
So it's like applying those same principles of like version control, automated testing, and all that to security practices.
Right, exactly. And that has huge benefits. You can catch security problems much earlier, ensure everything's consistent across your APIs, and it makes updating and managing your security way easier as things change.
It seems like it benefits everyone. Developers get to build secure APIs from the ground up, and organizations end up with a much stronger system overall.
Yeah, that's the goal. And that's actually what we're going to talk about next. We'll wrap up this deep dive by bringing everything together into some actionable takeaways, and we'll share some resources for our listener as well.
Awesome. Welcome back. Okay, so we've covered a lot in this deep dive, the main ideas of zero trust, the practical stuff for API developers. If our listener takes away just one thing from all this, what should it be?
I think more than any specific tech or tool, it's that mindset shift. Zero trust is about really changing how we think about security. It's not about that perimeter anymore. It's about assuming things might already be breached and verifying every single request.
So less castle walls and more like being a detective, always checking, always verifying.
Exactly. It's much more proactive, which actually fits really well with how we develop APIs anyway, that whole agile way of working.
Totally. And I like how Behl really emphasized practicality. It's not some crazy complex theory. He's giving us real steps, real tools we can use right now.
Right. And he kept saying, don't reinvent the wheel. There's so much out there already, standards, best practices.
Yeah. Are there any favorite resources you'd recommend for someone wanting to learn more?
Definitely check out NIST's cybersecurity framework. That's a really good place to start. It lays out the basics of zero trust. And there are tons of open source tools and libraries, too.
Okay, so it's about finding the right tools and not being afraid to ask for help.
Exactly. There's a huge community of folks who've already tackled a lot of these zero trust challenges.
That's great. Now, one thing that stuck with me was Behl's idea of security as code. Can you explain that a bit more for our listener?
Sure. It's basically making security part of your development process, just like any other code you write. All your policies, configurations, tests, they all become code. And they go through the same checks and balances.
So instead of security being this separate thing, it's built right in from the beginning.
Exactly. And you get so many advantages that way. You find
Yeah.
problems earlier, you make sure all your APIs are consistent, and it's much easier to keep everything updated as your system changes.
So it's good for developers, Andy, good for the organization as a whole.
Yeah, everyone wins. Now, of course, there are some challenges when you start implementing zero trust. What are some things our listeners should be prepared for?
Well, one of the biggest things is probably the culture shift. It's a new way of thinking about security, and it takes time for everyone to get on board. It's not just tech, it's people too.
Right. You need developers, security teams, even the business folks, everyone working together.
And then there's always that balance between security and performance. We don't want to bog our APIs down with so many checks that they become unusable, right?
Yeah, finding that sweet spot is key. Good security, but also a good user experience.
Okay, so culture, performance, and what about just the ongoing work? Maintaining, monitoring all this.
That's super important. Zero trust isn't a one-time thing. You have to constantly be watching, checking, adapting to new threats.
Which is why Behl talked about those tools, SUM and SOAR, to help automate some of that.
Exactly. They're like your early warning system.
This has been a fantastic deep dive. I feel like we've really explored zero trust inside and out, especially for those building APIs. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listener with one last question, something to really think about. Behl's talk got me thinking about how this zero trust shift. It's bigger than just tech. It's about how we think about trust in general in this digital world.
That's a really interesting point. Zero trust forces us to rethink how we build trust, not just in our systems, but in our organizations, maybe even in our personal lives too.
So the question for our listener is, how would using these zero trust ideas in your work, in your projects, change how you think about security? It's a big question, but worth considering.
Definitely. It's not just the technical details, it's the deeper meaning of what it means to trust in this crazy connected world where everything's vulnerable.
Yeah, it's complex, for sure. Something we'll be figuring out for a while, I think.
Absolutely. But this deep dive gives a good foundation to start exploring those ideas and building that more secure future.
I totally agree. And we hope you keep learning, keep experimenting, and share what you learn with others. Until next time.